When two young women didn't return home from a trip to the beach, investigators were baffled.
Because the offender left so little physical evidence at the scene, at first detectives didn't know exactly what happened at Alligator Point that day.
And the more investigators discovered, the more confusing the clues became.
We considered all of the possibilities. Was this a random crime, or did the offender have some reason for this attack?
Authorities wondered if it was only the beginning. Alligator Point, Florida, lies at the end of the road less traveled. An out-of-the-way beach that sometimes plays host to students on spring break. Until one day, when it was the scene of shocking tragedy. On a warm spring afternoon, off-duty police officer Anthony Curls was sunbathing on the beach with his wife.
The beach was pretty much isolated during that day. There was a few people at the beach, but not too many. The ones that I did observe, they were kind of distanced away from where I was located at.
Then Curls heard something totally unexpected.
While I was laying out at the beach, I heard some gunshots.
But as he walked towards the source of the sound, Curls found a scene he would never forget.
I observed a couple of young ladies laying in a beach in a peculiar position. They were close up here near the brush. What drew my attention to them was they'd been laying there for a while. I walked up to them and discovered, the two young ladies were deceased.
The off-duty police officer immediately called for help, hoping the offender might still be in the area. But it was too late. There was no sign of him except for the two bodies he left behind. Driver's licenses identified the victims as Cherish DeSantis and Megan Carr, both 16. Franklin County Deputy Sheriff Major Mike Mock has seen lots of students flocking here from all over the state and even outside Florida.
Both victims was from Thomasville, Georgia. It's about 80 miles north of us.
Detectives began their search for anything that might help them identify a suspect.
Initially, the first part of the investigation was to try to canvass the neighborhood and talk to any of the neighbors down on Alligator Point to find out if they'd seen anyone out of the ordinary or anybody unusual. And then we conducted a search of the dunes, sand dunes, and the water to see if we could find a murder weapon.
But the search for a murder weapon turned up nothing. Next, the police tried to determine whether the killings were a random act or something planned.
The next theory was that the perpetrators had followed the two victims from their hometown out of Thomasville down to Alligator Point.
Investigators contacted Detective John Richards in the victim's hometown. The possibility that a killer might be lurking somewhere in their tight-knit community put everyone on edge.
It was a very uptight time here in Thomasville, Georgia, during this investigation. We definitely want to find who was responsible for it, and this community, Thomas County, was hoping that it wasn't one of our own that committed this crime.
Police began their investigation with the victim's classmates. Perhaps these popular young ladies had enemies in high school.
We talked to a bunch of people that would be affiliated with the school, teachers, counselors, friends, and during the course of the interviews, we were eventually able to alibi all the students here in Thomasville, and they were all cleared.
With their leads drying up, investigators looked for a new direction. So far, they had found no reason why anyone would have wanted to harm Megan and Cherish.
They were very well liked in the community. Cherish and Megan, they were joined at the hip. They were born, I believe, one day apart. You saw one, you saw the other.
In the hunt for new leads, the resources of Franklin County, Florida and Thomas County, Georgia were stretched thin. Investigators needed help, so they turned to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Special Agent Wayne Porter reviewed the medical examiner's report and noticed one detail in particular. Both victims were shot twice in the head by someone who left no trace.
There was no physical evidence at the scene. The victims had not been disturbed, almost as if they had been executed.
With no motive or evidence to go on, the FDLE assigned a criminal profiler to the case. Special Agent Dale Hinman joined the team. Certain facts of the crime captured her attention at once.
When all of the potential suspects from the girl's hometown had been eliminated, we had to consider the possibility that this was a random attack.
Hinman believed that the murderer was already looking for his next victim.
We knew the person responsible for this crime was armed and dangerous. We just didn't know where or when he would strike again.
Police feared the murderer would strike again soon. They needed to find hard evidence, and fast. Hinman and Franklin County investigator Mike Mock headed to the scene in the hope of figuring out the offender's motive. The position of the victims' bodies was the first clue they considered.
This is the area where the victim's blanket was found. And as you can see by the diagram, the victims was laying one on top of another. And early on, we was wondering if they may have been posed, the victim had been posed.
Normally when we see posing in victims, it's usually more of a sexual nature, and the victims' bathing suits are in the correct position. So this looks more like the two victims were sitting here together, and as the subject approached, he shot the first victim, who fell backwards, and this victim stood up and reacted and was shot and fell in this position.
There didn't appear to have been a sexual attack, so the team considered other motives, perhaps robbery.
Is anything missing from your crime scene?
Dell, as you can tell from the photograph of the crime scene, nothing was disturbed, nothing was taken from the crime scene. And also the victim's car was still in its position. They left it in when they walked down to the beach.
But if the crime wasn't motivated by robbery or sex, what was it about? Hinman wasn't sure, but she believed more strongly than ever that the two victims just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
This seems to be such an impersonal crime. I don't think someone targeted these victims and followed them down from Georgia. It looks more like they were driving along here, saw the victim's car and cut through the dunes and discovered them here.
And if this was a crime of opportunity, the perpetrator was most likely to be a stranger, someone who might have attracted attention.
Perhaps we should contact some of the local businesses to see if someone noticed anything out of the ordinary.
Detectives questioned the staff at local establishments about anything suspicious, and eventually got lucky.
A bar owner in the immediate area had indicated that a rather strange fellow came into the bar in order to drink just prior to what we believe the time of the shootings.
According to the bar owner, the man muttered something that caught his attention.
When the time for the bill came, the owner suggested, well, since the drinks were late coming to you, they would be free. And at which time the individual said, no, you better take my money now because this could be my first and last drink.
This seemed such a strange request that the bar owner took note of the man's face.
We learned that they had a fairly good description of the individual, so we decided to bring a sketch artist in to document that particular description.
Slowly, an image emerged. Could this be the man who killed Megan and Cherish? The sketch was distributed in the immediate area, as well as in the victim's hometown. Meanwhile, The investigative team, including Agent Hinman, turned to other leads. They focused on the type of weapon used in the crime, a Garcia Rossi .38 caliber handgun.
Most of the gun owners who would live in this area of Florida are much more likely to be hunters, and they would carry rifles as opposed to .38 caliber handguns. This could be a good lead to pursue.
The fact that the murder weapon was uncommon should have worked in their favor, and eventually it did. But the lead that emerged wasn't in Florida, as Agent Hinman's profile had predicted. It was 80 miles away, where the victims lived in Thomas County, Georgia. The prospect of a killer living amongst them struck even closer to home.
One of the people that the trace came back to was actually a neighbor of Cherish DeSantis, which that really sent up some red flags.
His name was Jonathan Peter Lane, and his face was eerily familiar.
We had started digging into this particular individual's background, and the composite that had come out in Florida looked very similar to this guy that lived across the street.
Investigators now suspected a man who knew one of the victims. Could Agent Hinman have been wrong? Agent Hinman's profile predicted the murderer was most likely to be a stranger from Florida, but that's not where the latest piece of evidence led Georgia detectives. Their strongest suspect so far was a neighbor of one of the victims. He owned the same type of gun used in the crime.
When we visited this suspect, he was very cooperative. He couldn't remember where he was on the particular day in question, but he also stated he didn't even know where Alligator Point was.
The police asked Lane if they could test his weapon.
He was still in possession of it, and he was very cooperative and provided it for us to run ballistics tests on.
At the ballistics lab, experts compared the rounds from this gun against the bullets removed from the bodies. The indentations created by the barrel on the rounds didn't match. The test was conclusive. Lane's gun was not the murder weapon, and he was eliminated as a suspect. But Agent Hinman wasn't discouraged. She always believed that although the victims were chosen at random, there was something about the way they were killed that left nothing to chance. She consulted with expert forensic psychologist Pat Cook to toss around a theory.
Both of the victims are shot from very close range with a Rossi .38. They're shot twice in the head, and they really didn't have much time to react.
That's what you people in law enforcement call double tap, isn't it?
Exactly. So we're wondering if this is an individual who may be associated with law enforcement or who's aware of the type of training that we receive.
Hinman reasoned that if this criminal had received some kind of special training, it might have revealed itself in other ways, like choosing an isolated spot that was both near a road, yet out of sight of passing cars.
A lot of this property is just basically wooded with a road that just goes right along the coastline, but there really aren't that many houses, if at all, in this area.
And somebody driving along the road might not necessarily see a criminal act taking place down at the beach, as long as he's checked it out just to make sure there's nobody else around.
Another piece of evidence suggested that the offender might have had his victims under surveillance, like a trained assassin waiting for the right opportunity to strike.
There's cigarettes that are on the ground beside where the victim's car was previously parked, and neither of these young women smoked.
So it's likely that your offender spent some time there, maybe getting up his nerve to do it or waiting for the right opportunity.
The offender walked all the way up.
In a town as small as Alligator Point, with only one main road going in and out, a strange vehicle might have attracted attention. Police had set up roadblocks so that no one could get through without talking to authorities. Finally, they came across several witnesses who noticed an unusual car in the area that day.
During the interviews, we discovered that several witnesses had seen a blue Plymouth Volare in the area around the times of the shootings.
Armed with a description, the FDLE team began to search for the car.
We went to different dealerships in the area. to see if a similar vehicle had been sold in the area or even repaired by that particular dealership. We came up with over 70 vehicles that possibly could fit the description that we had at the beach.
But there was no way to know what color each of these vehicles was, except by checking out each one individually. Detectives hit the streets and started to eliminate all the Velaris that weren't the right color. Eventually, the list dropped from 70 to 3.
We found that one was a minister that happened to be playing golf that day, so we eliminated him. One was a woman that actually was in Georgia the day of the homicides, and she was eliminated.
Now there was only one car left on the list. It belonged to a Tallahassee man named Robert Rodriguez. When they approached Rodriguez at his home, police found him cooperative but vague.
Investigators explained the purpose of their interview, at which time Robert Rodriguez denied ever even being in the area of Alligator Point. However, he could not remember what he had been doing on that particular day.
Back at the FDLE, investigators ran a routine check on Robert Rodriguez and made an interesting discovery. Rodriguez had been a police officer, an important clue that fitted Agent Hinman's profile.
We believed Rodriguez was a good suspect because of his law enforcement background. Police are taught to shoot the target twice or double tap the target, and that's exactly what happened to these victims. Additionally, he was from the Tallahassee area, so he would have been familiar with this beach community, but he wouldn't have known the victims.
Police now considered Robert Rodriguez a prime suspect, but they still didn't have a motive or anything that would tie him to the crime.
Due to the lack of physical evidence, investigators needed a confession or they needed the gun, or both. So what investigators attempted to do was go back and re-interview Rodriguez.
But when they arrived, they found that Rodriguez had vanished. The case took a bizarre turn when a call came in from a man claiming to be Rodriguez.
In this message, he admitted to the killings and that he was going to commit suicide.
Rodriguez then promised to explain himself further in letters he planned to send to the victims' families. The letters arrived a few days later. They contained a confession and also confirmed something Agent Hinman had suspected all along.
According to Rodriguez, the victims at Alligator Point were picked randomly. It was an isolated area, and they just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. The reason for the shooting, according to Rodriguez, was that he just had intense rage and anger inside him.
Rodriguez made another claim in the letters, something that put investigators in an immediate race against the clock.
He indicated that he was near the Grand Canyon and that he was going to commit suicide there. Investigators immediately went to Flagstaff, Arizona, and began the search for Rodriguez.
They found him, but not before he had carried out his threat.
When investigators arrived in the Grand Canyon area, they located Rodriguez in his vehicle. He was dead. He had actually bitten into a vial of cyanide, just like he said he would in the letters.
Police never recovered the .38 caliber weapon used in the murders. But a follow-up investigation allowed authorities to close the book on another unsolved case.
Rodriguez also confessed to the murder of Valerie Hunt. She was a college student in Tallahassee who was last seen sunbathing beside a local lake. Her body was found 3 months later. No suspects were ever developed in the case until Rodriguez wrote a letter that included details that only the killer would have known.
Rodriguez matched Hinman's profile almost exactly. A man with police training who chose his victims at random and left behind a clean crime scene because he knew what police would be looking for. But for Hinman, being right wasn't much consolation.
Rodriguez claimed he committed suicide because of all the misery he had caused. But in reality, his cowardly act left so many questions unanswered. Not only was Rodriguez's suicide no consolation, it also deprived the families of these innocent victims of the closure they deserved.